Tony is the Enterprise Agile and DevOps Transformation Director at Atlassian from Amsterdam.
Hi, just checking my mic's working. Good afternoon, everybody. Hello. So, "18 years ago, on the day before Valentine's Day, there was a magical moment for everybody in this room. A bunch of people who really cared about software got together in Utah to write down the only things they could agree on that would make a difference. They gave us, on that day, the Agile Manifesto. Now, the challenge with the Agile Manifesto is it said absolutely nothing about scaling. So, we are left today with something that 17 people, really smart, tried to solve a problem they saw every single day in their lives, wrote down some awesome principles, wrote down an amazing set of things we should care about over other things, and now every single large organization on the planet is trying to take those things and make them work from 7 people to 7,000 people. Now the challenge is with that it was never designed to handle the fog of scale. If anybody's ever worked in an organization with 7,000 people, just finding out what the heck is going on is hard. I've never seen a Kanban board that shows what 7,000 people are trying to do. So, what that typically ends up looking like when we try and scale those principles in most organizations with no real guidance is it ends up looking like people trying to make experiments up at huge scale. And executives have kind of been left on their own to work stuff out. And most of these executives have become so far away from the work, they don't know how to fix the problems they are desperate to fix. I'm really fortunate in my job. I get to speak to some really senior people in many companies. I had a conversation recently with a president of a huge organization. And the conversation went as follows. And it reflected a conversation I had with my previous boss at one of my previous organizations, who was a CIO for thousands of people. And I said, he said, "So, Tony, how do I help those 2,500 people who build software for me? How do I help the other 10,000 people who have to make that software work?" Because, and he put his head in his hands and he just said, "I have no idea where to start helping them." And this is a person who's trying to implement Agile at scale. And as Portia mentioned earlier, these people really sign up to trying to build great experiences for customers and for us. So, I've had some interesting experiences. I put up the timeline of my life. It always scares me about the kind of things I've got involved with. Somebody said to me earlier, "You've had a really exotic career." I'm like, is that good? I'm not sure. I've seen some interesting big things. I own the Agile transformation for IBM for a while. That's scary. If anybody's looked at the Disciplined Agile Delivery book, some of the stories in that book from Scott Ambler and Mark Lyons are from me. I'm the technical editor of that book. And I've done some other things that are interesting since then. One of the things I want to share with you as we go through this, if my clicker will work, there we go, is one of the things I found more and more is that scaling is about flow. We heard that earlier today. When you think about scale, you have to, my observation is, think it at its simplest first. So the first thing to think about is how do you flow work through that large organization as quickly as possible? So one of the things you need to be able to do that is to be able to zoom out, to see what the flow looks like in the organization. Now the challenge with that is we then need to build surfers, not oil tanker captains. And what I mean by that is we need to build executives and managers who are comfortable flowing across the top of all the waves of noise they see every day. Is anybody here a manager? Hands up. Don't be ashamed, it's fine. We're not going to... You now can exist in the Agile community. We welcome everybody. I kid you not. I mean, when I started out with Agile, you read every Agile book, and not one time did they mention a manager. It was almost like you had the CEO and 8,000 engineers. It was hilarious. But one of the things as a manager is, most of you spend every 30 minutes of your day on a different problem. And executives are equally the same. So we need to build people who can surf across all that noise and give them the visibility they need. Now, we in this room have the tools to be able to help. The question is, how do we take those tools to the people that need them and the leadership level? How can you influence those leaders to do better things, and what are the kinds of techniques that are available? So I'm going to walk you through some things as we go through the next section that will help. So these are the things, if you hear these in your organization, I'm going to tell you the kind of conversations you might hear, and as I wander around big organizations that I've worked with, these are the kinds of things I'm going, hold on, I need to go and help with this. So if you hear this, so the first thing is, everybody wants to be the best team. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with these. Okay, I've made friends and enemies at the same time. Let's all be frenemies. Okay, frenemies, okay. Everybody wants to be part of the best team. We can argue whether these are the best team, but they've got some of the characteristics. Hey, I'm from England. I mean, we can't talk about the best team. Our English football team did really well, but I mean, I think we finally found how to operate as a team. But everybody wants to be in the winning team. And as Agile coaches or Agilists, we spend a lot of time focusing on how to be really awesome Agile teams. The challenge is, it's all about what does winning look like? Now, the definition of winning becomes really important, and as you become a manager, your definition of winning changes. I've written an interesting blog that I had a lot of feedback on called the Managerator. And the Managerator is a machine you get put through when you become a manager, where you go from a developer or a tester to become a manager, and you go through the Managerator machine, and that's where we wipe your brain of every experience you've ever had about how to build software. Because then we give you a spreadsheet and a Gantt chart, and that's how you now think about the world. And managers, it's worthwhile reflecting on how have you become one of those. So we have to define what winning is. So we all want the best team. We have to define what winning looks like. And we have to think about efficiency over effectiveness. Again, every manager, when you're a developer, you go, oh, I need some space to think, and just let me get on with my work, and don't keep piling work at me. And then we have this crazy thing where every manager who starts out with Scrum says, yes, but if we only allow the team to choose what goes into the sprint, they might not choose enough work. How many times have we ever seen actually that happen? In fact, most engineers, how I come from being a developer, we have to be the most optimistic people on the planet. So we write code all the time that we just think will work. So we are going to take in more than we can ever do. And if we don't, There's a whole backlog of stuff we'll just pull in. We don't all go, oh, we finished the sprint, let's just go home. But managers want us to be, they have to think about this balance of being, yes, but we've had a management consultant in that makes us record the timesheets, God help us, of every hour of every day we spend building code because we're measured by the hour. So, every manager thinks about this problem. They see a system, they look at all their teams, they find the one person who's sitting there not doing this. Somebody doing this? Oh, you need more work. Here, have more work. And suddenly you end up with a big traffic jam because you've just tried to make the system fuller. Now, one of the things is, when you think about, again, if you think about anybody here done queuing theory? Some people. Okay. Any manager here remember queuing theory? Some do. I always find it curious how software engineers, when they become managers, forget they're running a system just like a team is a CPU. And anybody ever put 80% capacity through a CPU? Anybody want to tell me what happens to that CPU? Quicker, does it go faster or slower? It goes hockey stick slower. Why do we think a team will be any different? It's not true. So we just need to, one of the things we can do is start to look at data to show that. So let me give you an example of where I saw this happen and something we did about it. So when I was working at a company that ships telecommunications software around the globe and connects billions of people together in real time for free. You may remember it from somewhere. One of the challenges we had there was that anybody here from a UX perspective? Honest, okay, a few people. Okay, so UX people care passionately about the user experience. All of us should, some of us do, they definitely do. And one of the things we had in this organization was they were the team that served all of the other platform teams, one for Mac, one for iOS, one for Android, blah, blah. And there was one team who thought about the user experience. Most UX people, when they do UIs, have to worry about pixel perfect images. It has to be pixel perfect before it gets put into the code. So what did we have? We had engineering teams sitting there waiting for these pixel perfect images to be created that they could then compile into the code and ship. So we had this huge bottleneck. So we had an awesome team of engineers who just kept writing more and more and more and more code that we couldn't ship, while they waited for the user experience team, with part of them being the UI, to build the pixel perfect image. And that became a huge bottleneck. So, what did we do? Well, anybody heard of this? Theory of constraints, anybody? Okay, if anybody wants to think about scaling Agile, this is one of your key ingredients. The Theory of Constraints by Eli Goldratt. And one of the things we thought about with that team is that team had become a bottleneck. So we could see, we actually made sure we measured the bottleneck. We used a particular tool to do that from a very famous company that provides work item tracking tools. And we visualized the work, and we saw that team was a bottleneck. So then what we did is we said, what can we do? What does that team then do? And we said to the team, what can you do using the theory of constraints to help fix that problem? Notice what I said there. There were 300 teams, many of those teams waiting for the UX team. One of the things we could have done is we could have had the senior executive shout at the UX team to go faster. Okay? Shout. Okay? I'm not sure that would have helped, but it may have made the executive feel better. Instead, what we did is we said to the team, here's an agile practice. How could you apply that to improve what the problem you're seeing is? Now what happened there was the development teams who realized they were creating more problems by piling more work into the system said, instead of creating more code for the application, why don't we actually build some tools so the UX team can build real-time changes into the user experience of the product so that we're not waiting for those user experience changes. So again, notice what we did there. We let the teams work out how to fix the problem. We gave them a tool to do that. We didn't tell them how to do it. The engineers were smart enough, because that's what engineers, we do that, right? We solve the unsolvable. Give us some tools to do that. This team created some extra tools for the engineer, for the user design people to actually build more easier user design capabilities into our product. So, think about teams over team. Anybody here systems thinking? Anybody? Okay, another, it's part of, if you use theory of constraints with system thinking, really powerful. It's so easier to optimize at the individual team level and make things worse. So when you think about Agile at scale, you have to zoom out and look at the flow of work across all of the teams to be able to do things better. Okay, so your epic is my feature. Anybody here use Scaled Agile Framework? Okay, I know what they did. Dean Leffingwell has a lot to answer for when he just stuck a feature in the middle of epic to story. And a lot of teams now then walked away who've been doing Agile for a while and went, what the heck is that? In some ways it's useful because we need to ship minimum viable things and we didn't really have a great definition of an epic. But one of the things you'll see at scale is you definitely need to make sure that things come together. So one place you can't get that wrong is in space. So I was really fortunate. I did some work with eBay a long time ago. And I worked with a guy called Ed Liu, who eBay asked to come and work with them. Has anybody heard of Ed Liu before? No? Okay, so Ed Liu was an astronaut who worked for NASA and went up on one of the shuttles. Ed Liu also he was one of the first engineering managers on Google Maps. And he also worked on the International Space Station. And he tells a really good story about scaling big things that can't go wrong. And one of the stories he told me was, we were talking about how do you scale really complex things, especially geographically dispersed, because on the International Space Station build project, all the components were built in different countries to make it international. Every country was given the ability to participate in the construction. And we think we have software problems. So, they give each country a component to build. Now, the key thing there is what? How does it come together? Because in space, that has to work, just to be clear. Okay? There's no, let's just reboot it. Okay? In space, not an option. Okay? We'll just call technical support. We'll see what happens. So in space, it has to work. So it was so critical that those components work together, they actually created a new role called an interface manager. And on both sides of the interfaces, they actually had an interface manager on both sides, a new role to manage the interfaces of the two different sides of the build project. And the other thing they did is, for a period of time before, as the manufacturing was starting, what did they do with those two interface managers who were in different countries? Shock, horror. They put them together so that they could build a relationship, because as we heard earlier, the Conway's law is actually about people. The architecture and the people are intertwined. So if the people got on and understand how to work closely together, the interfaces would get on and work close together. Anybody here a developer? Okay, so if your software that you're working on in your team is really slow, underperforming and very buggy, how many of you have seen that and then you realize your team is underperforming, slow, and frustrated, irritated, don't get on? As a manager, one of the things, when I moved out of being a coder to a manager of teams building code, the first thing I would do is I'd run the software. Now that's radical, right? Run the software that your team's building. How many managers do that? So I ran it, and I'd look at it, and I'd see, and the software for me, how well that software worked was the best indication of how the team's health was. All the, let's take a survey, happy face, sad face. No, run the code. If the code's crap, the team's struggling. So, in space, you can't have things go wrong. You have to think about the interfaces of things. So, let's go back one. So one of the things we did on this that we did at Skype, which is well written and documented, put the links in the notes, is who here uses story points for estimation? Who doesn't estimate? Okay. Who uses t-shirt sizes? Okay. We love you all equally. Okay. We love you all. And at Skype, we were definitely keen to make sure that every team got the ability to estimate how the heck it wanted. Because it should not matter to Skype how a team of 7 people worked out the size of stuff and the shape and design of things, right? We hire the smartest engineers on the planet to build that. But what we did need to understand at the interface level, when we thought about the capacity of the entire Skype organization in a 3-month quarter, how much could we get built approximately at the feature level or the minimum viable feature level across all the organization? So we needed some way, some common currency at that level. So at that level, we created something with a guy called Chris Matz. I worked with Chris there, and we created something called the Sweet Wild-Ass Guess. So at the team level, above the teams, the Sweet Wild-Ass Guess was estimated in team weeks. That was it, with only integers. So if I'm the product manager of iOS and I want something built into the core library of Skype, I would say to the team who built the core library of Skype, I would love this new feature. Can you build that part of it for me and with me? And that team would say, yes, it will take 3 Scrum team or 3 team weeks if they're using Scrum or Kanban. So at that level, the negotiation and all the interfaces were common, and everybody knew that team weeks were interesting enough to be useful, the precision was okay, but it worked in terms of the capacity management, and every team could still work locally differently. And that's one of the key things about agility, is you want to give that line about where the teams can work independently, but where the organization needs some commonality. So the edges have to fit. So one of the things when you think about the ways you work together, you don't have to all work using the same description of a user story. You don't all have to some of you might use given when then, some of you might use more traditional user stories, but at the interfaces of the things, you have to have harmony. You have to have ways that things work together well. And now some of you may have feature teams that can go end to end. The world I live in, that is a dream. And as you scale, you can't help but start to create some of those edges to other teams. It's really wickedly hard not to do that. So that harmonization point and those interfaces, they're the places to spend the time. They're the places to get the management buy-in. And that's the place to get your smartest people in your teams to agree how do those things work together. So it was really interesting when I went to work for the bank. Trust me, banking's hard. Anybody here from banking? Do not, hats off. Whew, trying to get anything done in banking is wickedly hard. I came from tech. I went to banking to see how hard it could be. I now know how hard it can be. And the thing about, so if you think about the edges there are many different edges to get sorted. When you think about all those components and moving parts, there are thousands of people and thousands of systems to do that. Think about the edges in that situation. So, next. And anybody know why we're waiting so long for stuff? One of my favourite questions. So, let's step back a bit. You're organising a team dinner. Team dinner. Anybody do that? Celebrate a sprint, end of sprint. Maybe you managed to ship something. Heaven forbid. So you've shipped something, team dinner. There's only 4 of you. Only 4. 4. You were awesome. Built the code. Okay. Your restaurant only allows you to get seated if you all turn up on time. What's the probability of you getting seated on time? Well, it's 1 in 16, because all of you have to turn up on time, and there are 15 other ways you won't. You're going to a restaurant. It'll only seat you when you all arrive. They'll only seat you. It's 8 o'clock when you get seated. What's the chance of you all getting to be seated at 8 o'clock? It's a 1 in 16 probability of it happening. So, given that, what's the chance of 4 teams shipping the software on time? Who depend on each other? Oh, I know. 1 in 16. Now this comes from the work of Troy McGuinness. Anybody familiar with Troy? I worked with Troy at Skype. This is the work we worked on together. It's a 1 in 16 chance of shipping that thing on time. So every time you create a dependency with another team, you double the amount of uncertainty you've built into the schedule. I'm going to say that one more time. Every time you create a dependency on another team, you have doubled the uncertainty of shipping the thing on time. Wow. Does anybody know why we're waiting so long? Well, it's not necessarily just waiting so long. Does anybody know when we're going to ship this at all? So, next question. This gets very controversial. So, 5 to 9 teams are 6% more productive. 5 to 9 people in a team are 6% more productive than 9 to 16 people in a team. However, if you have 2 small teams who are dependent upon each other, you're twice as unpredictable. Now what you're going to do? That's fun. So, given that, maybe you want to experiment. Radical. All this 7 plus or minus 2 was very interesting when you think about the Agile Manifesto with a team of 10 maximum. But when you go to 2 teams, 3 teams, 10 teams, all needing each other, your world may look different. And you should experiment, and you should measure and track those things. Because it may be that you have a better, more fun life. So, minimize those dependencies. No new news there. So, next. Green or blue? So, anybody here had to make a decision that's had to go up some sort of decision-making chain? Come on, banking people. Come on. Yes, thank you. Anybody who works in finance, banking, all those highly regulated industries, it needs 28 people to agree anything. This is where the finance people will take pity on me. I owned the risk control framework for the route to live for a bank for 2 years. I was 6'4" when I joined. So one of the things you often find is this decision-making process is difficult. Now, in 1942, the Germans fixed this problem. In 1942, the Germans were using a strategy in the Second World War called Blitzkrieg, which is basically lightning attack. It was a lightning attack way of taking across the whole of Europe. Thankfully, we're all here. It didn't work out so well. That's another story. But at the beginning, until General Eisenhower came up with a different strategy again, which is another story, the Germans created Blitzkrieg, and one of the fundamental strategies of Blitzkrieg that was very different from the Allied approaches to warfare was the commanders on the field were given direct decision-making capability. Why was that? Well, it's probably because they were the closest people to the enemy. So given the fact you're looking at the enemy, sending a message back to Berlin was probably not a smart idea, but we in the Allied forces were kind of still doing it. So, the Germans found a better way. I always find it ironic when you look back through history. My daughter's studying the classics. She loves talking about Athens. I hear a lot about Athens. I hear a lot about the Romans. And of course, all the philosophy and all the learning. I know we lost up to 98% of the learnings of the Athenians because my taxi driver from the airport told me many times about how awesome the Athenians were. I loved it. Was, and so I also think we've also lost a lot of newer learning than that. Decision making close to the people. So, an example of that I saw in my career. When I worked in this communications company, I worked with the product planning. I worked with the product planning team. We had 300 teams at one point building the product. We had the product manager of the chat experience begging for funding to improve the chat experience. And when I talk about improving, I simply mean making it more visible so we could see that there was a chat capability. I saw it go on, it went on for a few hours, and in the end he was overruled because we were primarily a video tool. We were winning the video tool, the video communications challenge. So what happened? The person closest to the problem, he'd got all the data, he'd even worked with some researchers, PhD people doing 10-year studies. This is what happened. We became 100% winner of a 1% market because everybody else moved to chat. Who'd have thought it? But he knew. Had they let that person make the decision who was closest to the problem, the world may be a different place and you might have a different chat experience, but most of you today will use WhatsApp or something else. So think about, make sure you have the decision making, and any managers in here, one of the things to lean on very heavily is the people closest to the problem. Now, however, I do balance that back to optimizing for an individual team is also not a good plan because you might just make one team better and the rest won't be. So, those closest to the problem, better with the answer. So, 5. My last one. We need to get this right first time. Does anybody remember right first time? It came out for anybody Lean Six Sigma, black belt. Oh man, we broke some things on that journey. So, right first time, a lot of senior executives, management consulting firms came in, told everybody they could make the best quality software. They just had to beat the engineers up more. Think magic would happen. So, I was lucky enough when I did work in banking, I worked with somebody called Zachariah and John Webster. So Zachariah and John Webster, Zachar told a great story. He's now on the general executive board of Lloyd's Banking Group. He started out as a business analyst. He's now on the board of the bank. And he told a great story. And he said when he was starting out and they gave him the digital bank to run, he said, I had an awesome idea. He said, the idea I had is we now have the ability, because we've got an iOS app and an Android app and we've got a web browser straight to our customers, Every customer, we know a lot of customers are struggling to manage their money. They always spend more than they earn. They tell us that they want to be better at managing their money. So we'll build them something called Money Manager. And millions of pounds later, we launch Money Manager. We have tens of thousands, if not millions of customers using our digital experience every day. How many used Money Manager? This is Zach's story. Less than 1,000. Less than 1,000. And what we learnt was, nobody wants to know they're spending too much money. They tell you they do. They say they'll buy something that will give them that capability, and then they go, I'd much rather not know. So Zach is now very bought into the fact that actually you won't get things right every time. So one of the things I'm very thoughtful about is stop calling things projects, stop calling things features at the executive level. They're bets. They're investments that could return less than they made, that you put in. The words mean things. We need to get the executives to think about it as investors. When we think about, so that's at the investment level, when we think about status reporting, who here does status reporting? Wow, a lot of you are very lucky. Adam Uret is one of the people I've worked with. He was at the Agile 2018, and I love the phrase, and I'm giving him credit for it. He talks about watermelon projects. Green on the outside, red on the inside. Why? Because nobody wants to be seen to flag up things are failing. Because you get this thing called executive help. Anybody who's had executive help normally knows that next time they don't want it. So follow the trends. As soon as you publish trends, you'll get better. So don't follow on the red, amber, greens. Make sure you publish trends. And the other thing is, instead of pushing out method, push out guardrails rather than heavily prescriptive method. So I'm just going to quickly canter through an example of what I mean by that. So one of the things we did at the bank was we used the drivers with some measures. So we said, instead of thinking about writing detailed method, here's some things you can write down. You should measure these things and show you're improving those things. So how are you going to impact those things? The next thing we said was, and you belong to somewhere in this shape thing, enabling functions being HR and finance. And then what we said was, you need to think about those drivers and think about where you are in that organization. And you need to measure those things to show that you are achieving improvements in those areas. We don't care how you do it. But get some agile coaches in, talk to people. We're just going to measure those things and see if they're going in the right direction with you. So across the organization, we put in various different measures. And an example of that would be something like this. This is one of the things we measured. So for the executive and the team, for value, we did those things. And we tracked it in Jira. And we worked with the internal audit teams to make that a reality. And it got a green audit, the whole framework did, in a bank. See me afterwards if you're more interested. So in close, to zoom out, scaling is about optimizing flow, focus the whole thing about flow, teams over team, harmony on the interfaces, bit of a skip there, minimize your dependencies, decide close to where you want to get to, and adapt or decline. Zoom out. And with that, thank you very much.
Tony, thank you. Alrighty. I think we've got a little bit of time for a few questions while we wait for Portia to come from downstairs, because there's another talk going on down there, a very interesting talk, which I think is just about to end or has ended. So, anybody got any questions for Tony?
Hi. For scaling in a large organization, such as a bank, is it a necessity to transform at some point in time also the organizational structure from the typical, product, channel, what have you, structure into a more agile, sort of synced structure, or is it not really a necessity?
So is it a necessity to realign the organizational design? It certainly will help. That is a longer journey. I think trying to find, what my guidance there is typically find the part of the organization that can do that soonest and show that that can work. But in the meantime, I would also say try and think about the component teams that we heard about earlier with Michael. Think about how you can assign those component teams to a value stream and experiment with that first. So they can keep within the component teams to start with, but can you assign them to a value stream and experiment in that way? So my short answer is yes, it's ideal if you can move the organization to align with the value stream, but you can experiment in areas in a more component-driven way but you still have to assign people to work across a value stream in some way.
Any more questions? Good. Well, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.